Welcome to the first foundational episode of the Rheology podcast. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, rheology? What is that? Well, quite simply, it's the study of which may seem a little confusing, but it's actually kind of simple. English speaking people like you and I, we use the letters R and E in front of just about any verb to completely change its meaning. Means to go back and to do it again. For instance, to reconsider or reopen or reunite. Basically, it's a do over. So, more specifically, here, we're going to talk about when it applies to the Bible, God, Jesus, and Christianity. My name is Scott Johnson, and I'm just a regular guy who has a personal relationship with God and who has spent a lot of time professionally in Christian ministry. Now, I'm not an officially trained theologian, nor do I have degrees in theology or the Bible. I simply came to a point in my life of wondering if there was more than what I was experiencing in the life of modern Christianity, and more specifically, the church. In this inaugural episode, I'd like to share the beginning chapter of a much bigger story that will unfold over the next several weeks, months, and possibly even years. Today, we begin with the concept of church. Where did it come from, and is it even biblical? I love movies. I'm a huge movie fan. And not only do I love watching movies, but I enjoy collecting them as well. I'm probably one of the few people that still actually has and collects Blu-ray DVDs. But I am a huge fan. And one of my favorite movie trilogies is the Matrix trilogy. You know, the thought that the reality that we think that we're living in is a lie, that whole thought is obviously very trippy, no doubt, but it's also incredibly powerful. It's like having your eyes opened for the first time. It might be a bit scary, but it's also truth. A thought like that simply makes me stop and think. It makes me think about what I'm doing and how I'm living, kind of like taking a personal inventory. When we stop to think, we release a potential power to live a more effective life. Today's episode will be addressing that very same idea in today's world of modern day Christianity. So, like Morpheus, I stand before you with a blue pill in one hand and a red pill in the other. If you're interested in seeing how deep the rabbit hole goes, then take the red pill and join me on a journey through history to uncover the truth about something that I think we all take for granted every single day. Now, as I said before, I'm not an officially trained theologian, and I don't have a degree in the Bible. My life was changed at the age of 15 when a good friend of mine shared this incredible news of this guy named Jesus. And he shared who he was and what he wanted with me. I started going with my friend to youth group events, and through that, I found a belonging and a commonality that seemed to fit exactly what I was searching for. And so much so that after high school, I attended Bible college for 4.5 years, and I left just one class shy of receiving a degree. But that didn't keep me from spending 14 years in full time ministry. The majority of that was spent working with teenagers, with students. In 2004, I left student ministry for a chance to help plant a church with the goal of planting my own church later on down the road. And this is where my journey of questioning actually began. In my days with student ministry, we always had a purpose and a goal, and that was of making disciples out of teenagers. I dedicated my life to befriend them, to love them, to disciple them, to teach them, and to also set up a team of adults around me to help me do that very thing. And we did that together. But when I got into church planning, I quickly realized that our main focus was not really going to be spent on making disciples. Instead, it was going to be spent on Sunday morning. We had meetings, weekly meetings, where we discussed it for hours. The majority of our money went to fund it. We kind of made it the front door to what we were doing, and probably actually the only door, really. And in doing so, it kind of made it seem like that was the pinnacle of a Christian's experience. Now, after only 1 year in this church plant, I was let go due to funding issues. And so I moved on. And eventually, God built a graphic design business for me. And I've been doing that ever since. But that's not to say that I didn't continue to have encounters with church. I was a part time staff on one new church, and then I was a full time on yet another. And then I've obviously worked with several different churches via my business. But still, through all of those instances, I started witnessing the same thing, which was churches being focused mainly on one thing. And that one thing was the Sunday morning service. In our family's expedition to find a new place to go on Sunday mornings, we continued to run into this same theme over and over. The people were different, the locations were different, but the underlying message seemed to be the exact same. And it was, above all, make sure you come to church, meaning a Sunday morning service. The seed of questioning that was planted in me earlier on was really starting to sprout and starting to grow. I couldn't help but to feel that something was seriously lacking in the main avenue of church in modern Christianity. I started looking around, and this concept of going to church was mainstream, and it has been for quite a long time. It was everywhere, and it wasn't just restricted to the churches that I had been a part of. In our Christian culture, some would see questioning as a sign of weakness, like as if I was questioning my faith or I was questioning God. And actually, though, the reality is that questioning things is actually a sign that you're quite alive and that you're stretching your beliefs. You're so much so that you're wanting to go and dig much deeper. This questioning that I had really was not prominent during my years in student ministry. I guess I saw the issue of going to church from a distance, but I didn't really experience it firsthand because honestly, we were just too involved in ministry, in a ministry that had a very specific purpose, which was not trying to get teenagers to church. And it was only after those years of church ministry that I started to take a step way back and a hard, rational look at the idea of going to church and even the word church itself. Some of the questions that surrounded those thoughts were, you know, why were we doing what we're doing? Why is it called church? And probably most importantly was, is this what Jesus had in mind all along? I really doubted it. And not only did I think that the mindset of going to church was a bit short-sighted, I also felt that something was really out of whack. Something was out of alignment. I'm looking at my Bible and I'm reading about those early Christians in the book of Acts, and I'm comparing that with what we typically do on a weekly basis in our Christian culture. And I can't help but to see that something is missing. So in late 2011, God placed me on a path for answers to those questions. Is there more than what I had experienced in church ministry? And more specifically, when it comes down to the actual concept of church itself. I love to research. I'm a researcher at heart. And when you start questioning these types of things, you inevitably start researching, which begins with looking at what's at the very center of that particular issue. And in this case, it was the concept of church. I started going to church as a teenager. And then I went to college and I continued to go to church on the weekend and even during the week. And professionally, I worked for a church. Let's face it, church has been centered as the most important element in a Christian's life, and it's a globally accepted concept. To question that could seem kind of like I was committing blasphemy and that God was going to strike me down at any minute, like Ananias and Sapphira. But I really wanted to know because if it was the center of a Christian's life, then where did it come from? And more specifically, where did this word church come from? I'm pretty sure that most Christians don't have the first clue. It's a funny word, church. It's not really used in any other form except for religious connotations or purposes. The English language, it always gets accused of being one of the hardest languages to learn, mainly because of the plurality of meanings of certain words. I mean, we've got these things called homophones and homographs, so they don't help the issue at all. A homophone are words that sound the same, but they have different meanings and they are spelled differently as well. Take, for instance, the words two, and two. T-O, T-O-O, and T-W-O. And also the words there, and there. And then for the Backstreet fans, bye, and bye. Now, a homograph, well, they're words that are spelled the same, they sound differently, and they also have different meanings, like the words bass and bass, and bow and bow, and then the words wind and wind. It's almost as if the word church has kind of become like a hybrid of a homograph and a homophone. We're all a little bit confused about its true definition, especially when we continually reference it in three different ways. I mean, does it mean a building? Does it mean a service? And does it mean an institution? In our modern culture, I would say that we would all say, yeah, I think it is. That it is all three, but it different somehow. It's almost puzzling like the nature of the Trinity. And as of the last few decades, we're now adding a fourth definition to it. And that would be that the church is us. Pastors and ministers stand from the stage on Sunday mornings, actually declaring all four definitions when they say things like, our church needs new carpet. Don't forget to bring a friend to church next week. And also, you are the church. It's a bit confusing. I get it that this is kind of the way it is, but the question would be, should it? Was this the intent of Jesus? Is this what he was kind of going for? Was this word meant to mean these four different things? In Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, Jesus says that upon the foundation of belief or faith, he says this, I will build my church. This is the first place that we see this English word in our Bibles in the New Testament. And so this is where I began my investigation. Now, when you're looking at scripture and trying to dig a little deeper, it's always smart to start with two areas first, right? The first one is the setting or the context. You know, like what's going on, where are we, and who's involved here. The second thing would be to look at the original language that was used and how it was written. In the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, and the New Testament is written in Greek. So in this case, I'm looking at this English word church in my Bible, and it was chosen to represent a Greek word from the original writings, either a translation or a transliteration. The Greek word here in Matthew 16 for what we have as church, the Greek word is ekklesia. It's actually more of a phrase, and it's made up of two words, actually. The first word is ek, which means out from or out to, and the second word is kaleo, which means to call. So, literally translated, ekklesia means calling out from or out to. Now, this word ecclesia, it's not a church word. Jesus didn't create it for religious purposes. It was a word, or more like a phrase, that was used in everyday first century living in the Greek speaking world. Ecclesia is not a religious term either. It's not what it meant. It basically has two main uses. The first one is really more of a very generic use, and it would be attached to a group of people like a crowd who had gathered together to hear something, like official news. Rome ruled the known world at that time, and let's say if they had official decree that was made or a law that was made, that news needed to be relayed to the civilian population, to regular folk living here, there, and wherever. And it was someone's job. They were commissioned with the task of making sure that this news got out to everybody. That person might have sent the news to a regional governor of an area, and then they may have relayed that to a village or a town leader. And then maybe that person, or I don't know, somebody else would have gone out into the central area of a village or town, and they would gather everyone from that area, that little village or town, to come and gather so that they could present their news. And they would call it their good news. That was kind of the idea for the Roman Empire. We've got some good news for you. And they would call that the gospel. That's where we get the word gospel. And they would present their good news to the people who gathered around to receive it. The phrase for people coming out to receive this good news, this gospel, were called the ecclesia, those who have been called out. So a messenger gave the news, and the ecclesia received it. They were called out. And again, keep in mind, this would be a very, very generic form for the phrase. But the other instance of the phrase is more of an official type of term. And it can be found in Acts chapter 19 when Paul's companions, Gaius and Aristarchus, were put in front of an assembly of civilians and officials to kind of account for Paul's ministry and his teachings. So Paul had gone into a Roman area and he started teaching people that there really weren't Greek gods. There was really only one God. And they started believing in that. The problem is that the lifestyle would be that you would buy a token of a god. You may have little action figure tokens of these gods. And so they took their tokens and they threw them away or they burned them. And so there were craftsmen there who were kind of getting put out of business. It hurt business. So they got angry and they called these two out, and a delegation of people, of official people, were called on the scene. And these would have been people who would have been called out of their everyday lives to represent both the government and the everyday person. And they came to facilitate the situation. They were the go-between. They were both the voice of the people and of the government. So they made sure situations like this one here in Acts chapter 19, that they were taken care of fairly and without bias. They made sure that people were taken care of and no one slipped through the cracks. They were the movers and the shakers of culture. This was a position of service, yet they were in the mix of making a difference in their society. The ecclesia concept was first created by ancient Greece, and then it was adopted by the Roman Empire. This was the first instance of democracy. It was revolutionary, as you can imagine, in having normal citizens become a part of decision-making in government. And by the way, ecclesia is where we get our modern concept of a democracy. It was the true beginning of a democratic society. So we now know that the Greek word ecclesia is what is behind the English translation of the English word church and what it originally meant. But I wanted to know more about the English word church because, kind of on the surface, it doesn't really look like those two words match up. To learn more about our English word church, we have to first understand where English came from. It's basically a hodgepodge language stemming from Germanic descent. And I won't sit here and bore you to death with all of the history. It's pretty in depth. But basically, our English word church descended from the Germanic word kirk, kind of like the captain. And it has its origins from the Greek. And I'm sure you're thinking, yeah, I know, ecclesia, right? Wrong. Church, or the Germanic form kirk, comes from the Greek word or phrase kuriakos or kuriakon, which is a possessive phrase meaning of the Lord. And we see this Greek word, it's actually only used twice in the whole New Testament. First of all, it's used in 1 Corinthians 11:20 when Paul is talking about the Lord's Supper, and in Revelation 1:10 when John is talking about the day of the Lord, Kyriakos, Kyriakon. That's it. So we know that our English word church did for a fact come from a Greek word, but just not the Greek word we thought. It comes from the Greek word Kyriakos or Kyriakon. Now, if you aren't confused, maybe you should rewind and listen again, because basically in the New Testament, there is a Greek word, ekklesia, and it shows up 115 times in the New Testament. 3 times we have decided to translate it as assembly, which is in Acts chapter 9, which we just kind of referenced to. The other 112 times we have decided to translate it as church, even though the English word church doesn't come from this Greek word. It comes from a different Greek word, the word kyriakon. Why are we using 2 completely different words and ideas to define one Greek word in our New Testament? I mean, is this a simple error, or was it done on purpose? That very question took me even deeper into my investigation. I've always looked at the early Christians and how they met in homes and they shared meals, they prayed together, they took care of one another and others around them. But they were also influencers and they were movers and agents of change. They completely turned the capital city of Judaism, which is Jerusalem, upside down in only 1 year. And then the rest of the known world at that time in only a few short years. How on earth did this uneducated, unqualified group of people do this? They didn't go to seminary. They didn't have degrees. They weren't full-time pastors. They didn't have a big building. They didn't have a cool band. They didn't have a big-time speaker, nor a big-time budget, and they had no marketing. But yet, despite being hunted down and persecuted and executed, they not only grew, but they thrived. Now, I look in my Bible at that, and then I look up from it and take a quick inventory of what we've got going on in today's Christian culture, and I think, what happened? We went from a thriving, unstoppable organism to an almost irrelevant organization that really doesn't do much and hasn't really done much in several hundred years. Where did it start to go wrong? Maybe, just maybe, it had something to do with the differences of these 2 words, church and ecclesia. This is the end of part 1. I'd really like for you to stick around here and hang in there with me and listen to part 2. Because we're going to go through some more history to rediscover the truth of this issue.